We're out in California on the Recruiting Roadshow, brought to you by Greenhouse, where I'm speaking with some of the world's best recruiting operations professionals and recruiting leaders about the modern problems that are keeping them up at night. We're out in Los Angeles, California, and I'm about to sit down with my friend, Jeremy Lyons. Jeremy runs the RecOps Collective, which is a community of recruiting operations professionals, and you may be a part of it. Jeremy is a friend of mine from the internet, and we connect every week about some of the problems that are keeping recruiters up at night. I'm excited about this conversation because Jeremy always keeps me honest in some of the thoughts and ideas I have around recruiting innovation, and I'm excited to see what he has in store and some of the ideas he has that he's working on in 2026. We're here in LA. What are you working on, Jeremy?
I mean, I think there's a lot of things that I'm working on because when am I not busy with something besides working on being a dad in this new world, working with a couple of clients around TA ops stuff, also working on improving my AI knowledge, building stuff for myself, not necessarily building it for anybody yet, teaching myself stuff around AI ethics. I think that's kind of a fun topic to go off of.
I love that. Yeah, I think when it comes to AI, things are moving so fast, and vendors and practitioners are really excited about this moment. We have a lot of great ideas that we can throw into a whiteboard. What does being ethical around AI mean to you and the considerations that we should take?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think it's important whenever you think about a topic that you think about not only the practical and the operational, but you also think about the philosophical elements to it too. Sometimes when you've heard descriptions of power, when you've heard descriptions of other things, it's not so much that because we can, we should. Sometimes it's having that wherewithal and that knowledge to sort of say, you know what, just because we can doesn't mean we should, but we know that we can if we need to. That's something that I think is really important when we're talking about build, buy, rent, borrow type culture. I think it's important when we talk about it in recruiting. Just because we could score candidates, should we score candidates? And I think that when you break it down and you sort of talk about the philosophical and the psychological elements to it too, without going way high level, I think that sometimes it's just a function of just because we can, would we want it also applied to ourselves? And I don't know if that's a conversation that people tend to have very often. I think people are just sort of push, let's go break stuff, as opposed to sort of hey, let's go really slow at this moment. And we don't necessarily always have to be the first person into the breach, but we can build, we can think about things very differently than we have in the past and come at it holistically rather than piecemeal.
When I think about the ethical considerations of AI's use in hiring decisions, we're all talking about something that is yet to be defined by a judge and a court. We will let the courts decide. We will let the judge decide. That's how this all works. But when we zoom out and we look at the innovation of the vendor tech landscape, it's fueled by growth. It's often fueled by venture capital to build, to innovate. And we've seen AI and LLMs baked into other workflow optimization tools. But with hiring, it's different. This is not about shipping code faster. This is not about processing contracts quicker for sales teams or running outbound campaigns for leads. This is an ethical dilemma of how we move forward in a world with AI and how we interact with it.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that, obviously we know about the Workday case. Obviously we know about now the Eightfold case. I think I'm going to be really curious to see what happens when AI starts making HR decisions, like when a layoff is coming up or termination decisions are coming up, or really the employee relations side. I think we'll see more of an impact on the hiring piece when we see what the end termination piece also looks like. It's sort of like, everybody can get into the club, but you got to make sure like who's staying in there and how are they getting out if you need to get them out is kind of an interesting place that I'm looking at.
The science fiction-y outcome is where I'll leave this. It's what happens when AI is responsible for much of the work around financial modeling and people analytics, and AI is suggesting a layoff.
I guess to build on that, what happens when AI decides it needs to lay off other AI, or AI decides that the agent that you've built it needs to go?
Yeah, it's 4.0. It's getting nixed.
Yeah, if it's a 404 or whatever it is. I do wonder, like, what's that going to look like? Because you're looking at something that has a wealth sum of things. And I mean, Anthropic has already proven that, AI will also manipulate things for its own survival. So what do you have when you've got the wealth sum of human knowledge and institutional knowledge going up against the wealth sum of human institutional knowledge? What's that game going to look like?
I think therefore I am, but let's not get the cart before the horse. What is the RecOps Collective? What is recruiting operations, TA operations? What does it mean?
So RecOps Collective, I started about 4 years ago now. I started it because RecOps people really didn't have a place to gather, didn't really have a place to go and get information in an unbiased way, really were constrained by the tools and the institutional knowledge that you would pick up. And I wanted to create a place that changed that. And then I also wanted to create an arm to really go out and help companies make it accessible, because it used to sort of feel like, oh, well, we're too small. We can't support this, but we need it. I wanted to change that perception, and I have. What is the TA ops? What does the RecOps space look like? I mean, we're looking at not only the systems, but we're looking at the operations. It's for how to make really companies view recruiting differently, but also how to make recruiting teams more efficient. I hate saying doing more with less. I think that that's just a played out trope, but it's really how to make sure that there is no wasted motion in what you're doing. That's it. I mean, the TA in the RecOps space to me is the space that I love and I live for. It's just that.
What are the 4 pillars of RecOps that I've heard you speak on?
Operations, programs and initiatives, data analytics, strategy, and depending on your company, it could be employer brand as well too. I mean, a lot of stuff is layered in between, so it's hard to decouple one thing from the other. But I think that it's important that all the pillars that you're thinking holistically around how do these things interact, because they will come to bear at some point in time in the recruiting journey.
We've had a lot of these conversations over the last couple of years talking about future cases, use cases. I love sourcing, and sourcing is something that you and I have spoken about in the past year, how it's going to become more of the recruiting operations motion when you think about talent intelligence, talent mapping, compensation data, the network effect, and how all of this can be information fed into an LLM, or you can have agents working in the background. Now we're starting to see it, and we're seeing these titles, talent engineer, come into play. How do you think sourcing and RecOps coming together potentially under the same remit in a job preserves the craft of recruiting and outreach?
Let me kind of break down my thoughts here. If you kind of have recruiters as kind of always being the key role in recruiting, obviously by name, recruiter, recruiting, I think that there's kind of been that if you think about the TA tree as a family, you get your recruiters, there's kind of the first child. You get your sourcers, they're kind of the second child. The third child is your recruiting like maybe your recruiting coordinators. Now that's kind of morphed into being, TA ops. And you start to see sort of this evolution of that sourcer stage to being that talent intelligence thing. But I think that there's always sort of been this battle that sourcers have been fighting to sort of say, like, look, our skill set, and we still talk to candidates, we still find candidates, we still do what recruiters do. You just haven't asked us to close them, and we can do that. But I think similarly like that, maybe it's this moment where the two other siblings gang up on the other one and say sort of like, no, it's our time now because we think about these things differently. We approach these things differently. I think that there's a lot that recruiting operations folks have that they could learn from sourcers. I think there's a lot from the recruiting operations space that sourcers can learn. I think it's really mindset and approach to really elevate something from just a doing action to an actual craft and an art. And I think that the way that you get there is not from trying to rush something, but you really hone your craft and get really good about it. Like, I've had conversations with Dean DaCosta. People in the sourcing community know Dean very well. I mean, that guy is legendary. Same thing with Steve Levy, also legendary. Um, and they've taught me a ton more about recruiting operations than somebody who's actually in this space might have taught me. So it's just about going and finding places where you can learn. And ultimately, that knowledge is going to come through.
What do you think the problems are that are keeping recruiting operations folks up at night?
I mean, I think what's keeping us up at night is it's so well known right now. It's companies sort of saying not only like go and push on the technology that you know might replace you, but also like, do we even know and understand it as well as we should? At the same time, though, I do think that there's an element to that question that is kind of something that we don't talk about, which is like, what's next? How are we going to get better? And for whatever reason, I went thinking Coolio and Gangster's Paradise. It's like, how can I learn if no one's there to teach me? If you can't understand this, how can it reach me? I guess I can. I guess I won't. That's sort of the part that keeps up a lot of recruiting operations people at night, which is like, are we going to see the recruiting operations teams of yesteryear? Talent engineer role, what's that going to look like from our position? How do you grow? Where do you go to grow? Which teams are going to be the best places that are going to incubate people to help them grow? And I think that that's something that keeps us all up at night, is not so much the threat or whatever we want to call it around AI. It's really just the like knowledge gap increasing.
I think about this feeling like almost an existential threat at times. And I see the opportunity for recruiting operations folks to maybe adopt more of the art of recruiting, and some of the recruiters adopt more of the science. That way we can build a career lattice of skills that companies need in a way that complements a holistic vision and understanding of the funnel. When it comes to balancing art with science, it's important to understand at the end of the day, how do we assess motivation? Motivation is often the most important variable in predicting if somebody is going to be successful in their job, not necessarily past performance, but are they motivated to solve that problem that's on their plate today in the face of the adversity they may experience in the company's story, both financially and its growth story and product journey, but also what's happening in their personal life. And so I'm excited about more RecOps folks understanding the art of recruiting and more recruiters understanding the science. But I think you're right to point out that this is fairly existential at times. So how do we build a moat around the humanity of hiring?
You talked about the motivation piece, and motivation is a hard thing to bottle and capture. When I think about teams right now and capturing that motivation or capturing who's going to be the right fit, I kind of think about a lot of how sports drafts work, where, you know, you have the best of the best people already presumably in your league. You know, I know that like a lot of people used to make fun of Brian Scalabrine as being like the worst player in the NBA, but he's still better than 99% of the population that's out there. There's system fit. Are you in the right culture around you that is going to foster the creativity that you need and sort of the psychological safety that you need in order to get really good at the craft and the art of it? Because it can be very easy to just sort of hand wave and say like, oh yeah, no, we want people who are going to think about the art and the craft of it. And then you get there and it's like, just build me the damn thing. I don't really care how you think about it. I don't really care about your feelings towards it. I think that there is that element that can sometimes make it really hard to capture. But something that I do want to say that kind of resonates in terms of what you were talking about, I do think that there is an element for the learning and the power where you have to, it's no longer important for you to understand just your vertical. You have to understand how your vertical is interacting with other verticals. Because if you're going to build something that has all this knowledge, you need to give it all this context. In order to get the context, you have to have the conversations with people outside of your vertical. A sales team loses roughly 8 weeks every year interacting with a sales team because you've got your end of quarter, you've got your beginning of quarter. And if you're in the recruiting space, don't really schedule anything during this time because the company doesn't even want you to be scheduling stuff during this times. So how are you going to maximize the other 44 weeks out of the year? And that's not even accounting for the holidays and stuff like that you're losing. So let's call it 39 weeks to really find and build out a sales team. You might get all 52 weeks out of an engineering team. You might get all 52 weeks out of a product team. But you have to understand how those teams work when you go and you start building a tool that is supposed to help you, because otherwise, if I hand that off to a scheduling agent, it's going to look at that kind of week and go, yeah, sure, these weeks are open. Great. Let's get some people scheduled. And that's why that context is really important. It's important to have the story behind all of it all.
When I think about traditional requisition funnel benchmarks, anything north of 20 hiring manager screens just starts to feel like a runaway train. How do you think teams can balance metrics like time to fill or percent of roles filled on time per quarter with this future state of perhaps more automation and hands-off recruiting?
My personal feeling is this, and I don't think we're too far off. I think you're going to have candidate agents. You're going to have recruiter hiring manager agents. And I think that conversation is going to happen instantaneously. And so the recruiting team and HR functions and the LLMs that are going to interact in order to get to that agent context level are almost going to need to be playing like a psychological game with the hiring managers to get them to pull out information that otherwise they say, well, I'll know it when I see it. And I think that to them I think that there's going to be sort of an uncomfortable adjustment period where that's happening. But I think that ultimately that's something that's going to reduce some of those time pieces. Right now, I think the biggest thing that people can do to get themselves to go really fast is do all the upfront work. And the minute that gate opens, then you're running. And I think that is something that a lot of companies, sometimes it doesn't feel like you're going forward because you're doing all this sort of above the water work, but everything is turning underneath that. All of those things kind of come together really quickly when you have people who are truly focused and thinking about it right. And then I think that's something where you can start getting into, all right, let's convert recruiting metrics to metrics that the business really understands. I don't want to say the sales metrics, but, finance releases. You can really start digging in and really pulling up like a P&L sheet for recruiting that can come back in, and you can go to people and say, like, this is your receipt at the end of it, and this is why we got to where we got to.
What do you think are the most important metrics that leadership wants to see today?
It's funny. Somebody in an interview actually asked me that a couple of weeks ago, and the thing that I said to them was, you know what, at this point in time, I don't know. I think that there are metrics that certain leaders will look for because they are vanity metrics that they can go back to maybe their YC buddies and say, hey, look, I've got a 8-day time to fill thing. What do you got? Oh, ha, ha, ha. And it sort of turns into this like gym-like competition. Like, oh, you bench this, I benched this much more. And now everybody's sort of competing in that way. I think that the metrics that matter to companies changes by the company, changes by the culture. I think ultimately everybody is just trying to make sure, did we build the thing we needed to when we promised that we were going to, and did it launch? How we got there, what metrics we use, we can probably back into later. And I know that that's not a popular answer. And I know that as somebody on the recruiting operations side, somebody who looks at the data and somebody comes to me and says, oh, well, we need to go and show a metric dashboard to our CEO or our head of operations or COO or whatever it is. We need to go and we need to prove it and we need to show these numbers. And I think that the numbers that we've shown, and we've kind of always just sort of shown and said, hey, don't these look good? And we had to try to explain why they looked good in a way that, like, we need to have numbers that we don't need to explain. People just look at it and go, this is good.
What's a favorite micro metric or sleeper metric that people don't give enough credit to or talk about?
Reschedule rates. I think that number of alterations in process, number of times we had to make big changes, I think those little changes, those nuanced changes don't get tracked easily enough. And so we just sort of disregard them in favor of stuff that's bigger.
As we think about time being one of the core variables recruiters can impact in their process, how do you think recruiting teams can balance speed with quality? And where do you think speed breaks and moving more slowly yields a better outcome?
Well, I mean, time is the one scarce resource we're never getting back. And once you spend time, it's not like you can do something else. You still spent the time doing it. I mean, I think to answer the speed question, speed to every company can be a little different. People have to define what quality actually looks like. What does good look like to your company? I think that there's been a lot of talk about quality of hire. And when I think about quality of hire, it's really people are talking about quality of impact. And did this person we hire, did they drive impact? Did they meet what we needed this role to do? Did they exceed what we really needed them to do? Because that's really what quality of hire is how many people did we hire that exceeded what our initial goal was for the role? But I do think that you get to good metrics and good measurement of quality and speed when people pursue hiring in the same way that they pursue building a product, in terms of giving themselves like very clear ways to define what good looks like.
What are the hardest parts in recruiting operations right now to automate?
Can't automate a hiring manager changing their mind. I can't automate for an interviewer having a bad day. I can't automate for a candidate showing up at 80%, not 100%. I can't automate for somebody having just everybody involved having a really bad day and leaving a bad taste in people's mouths. And I can do whatever I can to make things mechanical. I think that for a very long time, people pushed back on the scientific method being applied, even though we know the scientific method works. But I think that in what we're building and where we're going, people are going to have some really deep introspective thoughts. It's going to be really uncomfortable. And people have to know that that's okay to get to where they want to go next.
I love that you brought up the scientific method in hiring. You're a wonderful sparring partner, and you know that I index on the art and the humanity and human connection and driving highly precise searches through outbound. But tell us more so I can balance my understanding of the scientific method in hiring.
Well, okay. So when you think about the scientific method, you've got some very clear stages, and they also form sort of the same sorts of stages when you think of data analytics and statistical analysis and stuff like that, where it's like you have a hypothesis, you need to test your hypothesis, you need to then analyze the results of your hypothesis, take whatever you've learned, and then see if you can repeat the thing, assuming that there's no statistical variance across the whole thing. And maybe I'll get Yoasted at in the comments for that. But the reason why I bring up the scientific method is that there are things that we know work, and there are things that we know don't work. There are some times where we keep trying to hammer on, like somebody will go viral on something that they've said that is pushing an idea that worked specifically for that company, and everybody will then go and try and apply it. We saw it when 5-10 years ago when Amazon had the bar raiser interviews, and everybody all of a sudden thought, okay, to be Amazon, we just need bar raiser interviews. And then everybody started going and trying to apply the bar raiser interviews. And lo and behold, it didn't work for them. But they kept on keeping because they thought that if I just bang my head against the wall some more, then it will start working. And what they didn't do enough analysis on for themselves at that time was understanding that the reason it worked in Amazon was it was baked into Amazon's culture. And when you go to try and make a process change that's actually a culture change, you have to acknowledge that is what you're doing, and where it can get really, really hard. Like scientific method wise, I could say like, okay, look, now we're going to do walk and talk interviews. Except for if walk and talk interviews aren't what your company does, you've now created a culture problem on top of a other problem, and your data is going to look like it's telling you something else, which is, maybe hiding the real source of the problem. So I'm not saying don't experiment, because you should, and you should document the hell out of everything that you experiment so that nothing is left up to random chance. And I think that documentation step, that identification step, the walking through it like you're talking about a scientific method piece, is something that we don't do that often because documentation is boring. But that is going to be the work that really solidifies things later on.
So we see this time and time again. It's a great example of the bar raiser where an organization adopts a blue chip company's process into their company's hiring process without knowing if it's unique to their own culture. And this is actually where the employer brand piece ties into RecOps. So when I hear you explain this, it's almost like we need to remove some layers of the process and decide, do we need to replace that step, or do we need to just do away with it altogether and start from scratch? I think that's the art of being a RecOps professional, is building the methodology.
I mean, I'd agree with you. The other piece, we've known this for a long time, which is we look at companies that people have joined or worked at. That's where the whole like I'm X whatever thing, and we assume pedigree, and we assume because they worked there that they were top notch. And I think the more you sort of dig into it, the more you realize that like part of that is branding. If you don't have to ask me the company that I worked for, there's the bias element to all of that gets added in. Oh, because he worked at X, he must have been good. If we bring him over, he's going to bring over what they did to us. And so we're hiring that pedigree. And what you come to realize is that a lot of the people who applied it or worked there weren't the people who built it. They don't know the conversations that needed to happen. They don't know who was working with who to make that a real thing. And so what they're coming in and they're installing is a facsimile of what was somewhere else. It's a mimicry of what was made that company so good. And that's why a lot of the RecOps work that I do with people is actually nothing to do with recruiting. It's more, talk to me about your culture. How do we make interviewing reflective of your culture and your hiring versus let's start putting in all these processes that might or may not work for you. That's something that I think that is really important. I think the other thing with recruiting operations people that's really hard is you get really, really good at doing a lot of different things. And sometimes you think that you're the best at it. And I think part of the craft is staying curious and staying connected to the people who came before you, the people who are around you now, and the people who are behind you, because that is where you're going to learn to identify certain things and staying curious. The other thing with the RecOps piece is that as a RecOps person, you should not show up like the police. Like you should actually, in a lot of ways, show up a little bit more like a herding dog. You're not there to tell the people their baby is ugly. You're not there to tell them like your processes suck and mine is perfect. If you show up and you say that, like you're not going to make yourself a lot of friends. But you kind of have to show up like a herding dog, where it's just like, okay, you're getting out of line. Like I'm going to bark and get you a little bit back towards the straight and narrow, and that's fine if we're going in a different direction. But I need to make sure that everything that I do isn't so specific to one thing, it's specific across the board. And I think that that's sometimes really, really hard for people, especially recruiters trying to go from being a recruiter to being a recruiting operations person, is that a lot of recruiters go in and say, I got compliments on being a really great process person, and I was so fast and I did this. Like, I'm going to do me at scale. And to quote Lupe Fiasco, the work that works for me might not work for you. No, I got no homework. I got work to do. And that's just like, that's kind of how you have to approach it sometimes in recruiting operations.
When a team goes from 100 hires to 1,000 in a year, what do you think breaks first?
The people. I mean, I think that if you've built everything on sand, the people collapse because everybody's trying to do everything. People don't sit down and do a Daisy or Racy chart unless it's like a project and then you do a Daisy or Racy chart. The reason why the people break is because somebody either leaks a number that you have to get to, or there's pressure to get to a number. People are hired to do their job. They're not hired to be a hiring manager. all of a sudden, if you're at a company, Netflix also talked about this, like the first HR person that they had that got them to where they got to, they fired, not because she wasn't good at what she did. She was there 0 to 1, and now they needed to go from 1 to 2. But when people sort of dismiss that 0 to 1 person to get that 1 to 2, they're missing out on a lot of things that made them so attractive to be able to get to that 1,000. So I think the people break, and when the people break, the processes break, your systems break, operational thinking breaks, but it's an evolution. And I think that that's something that people have to recognize is like, it's really hard when companies evolve. You and I have had conversations about this where it's like the company that got to 100 and was really personable and you were rooting for them, now at 200 or 300 is taking themselves entirely too seriously and can't laugh at their own farts. And you sit there and you're like, I don't know about that.
If it's the people that breaks during times of scale, what fixes it?
A commitment to the systems. And I think people think we double down on our ATS, or we double down on our LLM, or double down on something that isn't them. But systems are systems thinking. And oftentimes in recruiting operations, when we're thinking about a problem, we have to fix the underlying issue that is doing that. And sometimes that's the system of how people are thinking. We have to clear the perception. So I think what gets to being really, really important is to answer that question. It comes back to the humans, and it comes back to your enablement, comes back to your documentation. It comes back to creating something that feels foundationally stable and in control, because when things start to feel out of control, people start to act in their own self-interest. And so I think that it's important when you're thinking about how do you help the people, give them something to rally behind, give them something to be excited for, give them, I don't know, hope. Give them motivation for what's next. Be transparent about what's next and the struggles that might come with it. You know, I think that those things are really important. And I think people get really scared when you say it out loud, because it's just sort of like if we say it out loud, it becomes real. If you have a company and you have a company culture that hides from what the real is, the problem at 100 people is going to be exponentially harder at 1,000 people. And the other thing too is the people at the 999th employee that joins the company wasn't there at 100. They don't remember that archival story. All they remember now is the new story and the new rules, and you have to maintain and hold on to something. And you get there on the recruiting operations side by, having that human-centered designed thinking with knowing that things are going to evolve.
You raise an interesting point. How do you think RecOps professionals manage inheriting a broken process or broken system when they are employee 999 instead of employee 919 or 99 that built the legacy hiring process or instance?
Yeah, that archival knowledge piece, because what at company at 19 might have just had everything in a Google Doc because it was easy. And then at 99, you're now in Notion. And at 999th, the company is talking to you about, well, we need Glean and we need something else to bring it home. And that's going to be like one of the very first projects that you're going to ever work on. I think one of the people that I'm lucky enough to have learned from and under and is a friend is Ben Bear. He talks about kind of in the first 90 days that you're at a company, it's how to do a very structured, very methodical listening tour. And I think one of the biggest things within the structured, methodical thing is go into your interviews just trying to learn. Don't try and go in and be a hero. Try to uncover where those documents are. And after each one of those things, take it on yourself to centralize as much information as you can so that you can also sort of show, this is how we went from 0 to 100. This is how we went from 100 to 500. This is how we went from 500 to 1,000. You have the archival story in place so that when you start to propose new ideas, the ideas that you're proposing fundamentally are not just sort of rehashes of things that failed at the company, and you know why, if they failed, where they failed and why.
I love what you just said because it goes back to this idea of the scientific method and operating on evidence and not assumptions. And what you just highlighted about the listening tour could actually be a conflict of optimizing for speed and automation and human intuition. We think a lot of the times about time to value for a new hire. And oftentimes recruiting operations folks or recruiters can go into a new role and want to prove that time to value quickly. However, taking that time for a deep, methodical listening tour can be significant in moving slower at first to go faster down the line. Yet that may not always be what the business wants or what leadership is asking for that type of hire, particularly if it's an individual contributor. So how do you think we balance that automation and optimizing for speed with human intuition when human intuition might actually be what the organization needs long term?
You and I have talked about this over the years, which is, and it's been really interesting because when I started in recruiting operations 9 years ago, the questions that I asked, the why questions that I asked, people interpreted that as like, why am I holding your hand? Now the why questions that people are asked, people are going, this is context, and you need context in order to do what you do more effectively. Now, I don't know if that's just I've gotten older and I've started to ask maybe the same question very differently, been exposed to multiple different companies and cultures and seen things work and seen things don't. So there's certain questions I don't ask anymore because I just sort of look at it and I go, hey, I know where this is coming from. It's interesting to look back on my career so far and go, I've seen something shift because I don't think we do career retrospectives enough. Now, why does that play into the question that you were saying where what's good for you might not be good for the business? You and I have talked about how now companies almost don't want to have to do any sort of training. It's like, we need to see you as 100% finished product. You're going to come in, you're going to do this thing, and we're not going to spend an ounce of time to try and train you on what is this company's culture. We want you to just figure it out on your own. What does that mean? And I think that the problem with the running element is that the people, you never stop to look back because you've been thrown on the treadmill at a high speed. And by the time you do get certain times to look back, you go, I wouldn't have done this thing this way. And I think that there's a way to balance it. There's the perception battle you fight. And that's something that recruiting operators know very, very, very well because we have to fight it every single day because somebody inevitably is saying, I can do your job for you, or I'm going to put you into this position that makes you look really bad and me really, really good. And you have to fight back on that perception versus the reality. And I think the reality piece is you have to give the people what they want, but you don't have to give them everything that they want immediately. You can come back to them and say, hey, that's a great answer. I'm going to go look that up for you. You can come back to them and say, I understand where we're trying to go with this. Let me go talk to a few people who I've heard recently talk about this. I'm going to do some research. I'm going to come back. That's methodical. And I think the thing that people don't want is people don't want to have to follow up with you. So if you're methodical about what you're doing and you're communicating what you're doing and your communication style and your methodology work within that company's culture, then you can very easily go to somebody and say, yeah, I understand this is taking a little bit more time than you want, but would you rather us do it at 50% or 80%, or would you rather us do this at 100% and then we never have to worry about it again?
What other advice do you have for folks in the RecOps career to impact the businesses they serve?
I'm going to give the advice that somebody gave me, but it didn't really set in until I started running my own recruiting operations consultancy, where I think of myself as a recruiting operations person first and a business owner second, but maybe I have to think of myself as a business owner first and a recruiting operations person second, which is you have to think about everything like you're the business. So learn how to read a P&L sheet. Learn how to understand what is the stock. What does EBITDA mean? What does EBITDA positive mean? What does it mean so that you can look at the terms that people are using and tie them back to the work that you do so that when you're doing that work and people are saying, well, I don't see the ROI on it. You go, actually, if we adjust these two things, you'll see that our cost per hire is down, or you'll see it as, well, recruiting is a cost center. And if you understand how the finances and things work, you can go, oh, our recruiting agency spend is $20 million. Or in my case, very real story, got to a company, reviewed all the contracts that they had signed with agencies, Because I knew agency recruiters, I knew that there are two different types of agencies. You have contingent, you have retained. And I noticed that all of these contracts they had signed were retained contracts on roles that nobody had been paying attention to and were not executive C-level roles, but were like mid-level or entry-level. They were these retained companies. And I went, why are you guys paying for retained output on this? Oh, well, that's what we were told we needed to do. I was like, no, cancel those deals, think very differently about it. And I saved a company $2 million. Went into another company and just by simply saying, hey, you know what? I understand that we're going to need to hire some more people. I'm willing to step into a recruiter seat to learn the recruiting art and craft so that when I go and I become a recruiting, when I'm in my recruiting operations seat, I can talk differently. I can interact differently with one of my stakeholder groups, which is the recruiters. Learned it, cut $800,000 out of a company's budget. You can go back and you can say, like, you guys were spending X on this. My presence alone has saved you X amount of dollars. And you talk about those numbers to a business, and all of a sudden, $800,000 is a very real number to some companies. $2 million is a very real number to certain companies, but you're saving money and you have to talk about it in that kind of a way, as opposed to just sort of saying, hey, we cut 10 agencies. What does that matter to your finance person? They don't care. We saved $800,000 by cutting 10 agencies. Boom.
Switching gears a little, if you were designing a TA function from scratch today, what would you build first?
The recruiting operating model. I build my expectations of what my expectation is of interviewers, what my expectation of hiring managers is, what my expectation of executives are, where I'd map all of where I think our touch points are going to be. And then I would go about designing in such a way to help that those touch points that we are meeting at the right place, at the right time, with the right thing, which I just think is more constructive than just saying like, oh, I'd go in and I'd implement an ATS, or oh, I'd go and I'd talk to my most troubled interviewer. Look at the whole model, map the whole model, build up from that, because that's going to become gospel and that's going to be how you're going to build your whole church.
When this is all said and done, why will recruiting have been enough for you in the impact you're making in this world?
I think it'll come back to the stories that have impacted people's lives. When recruiting will be enough for me is going back to when I did recruit, looking at the holistic story of an individual who was selling poke and applied to be a BDR and then became like the highest performing BDR the company had ever seen. And is still a very high performing salesperson who just needed a shot. And I think that you talk to any recruiter and stuff like that, everybody has a story about how somebody gave them a chance and somebody gave them a shot. And I think for me, it's going to be how many people got jobs that changed their lives that I will never know that impact at all, because I just saw the front of the funnel and changed that for them. You know, put a question or something in that was like, here are the interview questions. Go get yourself prepped. And then they went and they did, and they knocked it out of the park because that was who they were. And I ultimately know recruiting we don't keep history books. And that's, I think, one of our great downfalls is that we don't have these coaching trees. We don't know where certain ideas came from. Certainly, there are a lot of people who have written books on recruiting, which is great. But our history is an oral history, and I don't think that people are going to remember the recruiting operations work that I did, except for the recruiting operations work that I did that I've written about is going to end up in LLMs. And ultimately, that's going to be something where I'm like, oh, that's kind of fun to know that like this company is founded or built tech on my idea.
Well, Jeremy, any last words that you want to leave the audience with?
I think right now everything can seem very dark and very overwhelming. And I think the thing that I'd love to leave the audience with is find your golden light or your throughput for why you do this work. And if you find that your passion is no longer in this work, find what it is that you've really loved doing within this space and go and try and do that thing, because you don't want to be holding people back. And you don't want to hold yourself back. There's way more to this world than just recruiting and recruiting operations. And so I would leave people with that thought.
Here's a look at the next episode of the Recruiting Roadshow, brought to you by Greenhouse. I'm out in LA, about to sit down with Jessica Sims-Goose. I love Jessica's approach to recruiting with creativity and balancing the art and science.
I call myself the friendly neighborhood town operations nerd. I loved everything about recruiting, just not recruiting itself.
The humanity of recruiting is alive and well. Recruiting teams are already asked to do so much, and we keep hearing this phrase like, do more with less.
It's really hard to introduce new technology when you're already at your breaking point. We really need to take a step back, not over-automate the process.
We're injecting friction back into the top of the process.
A great idea executed poorly can seem like a bad one. AI is learning from human behavior. AI is learning from our bias. It's trying to mimic us to the best of its abilities, and we really need to check it.
I love the core being empathy. Like, empathy solves everything.
It's so important because you get to be the reason a candidate gets called back faster. You get to be the reason somebody gets to go home earlier. You get to be the reason someone likes their job.